witness for us?
I do. The next witness giving evidence today, my lord, is Seamus Searson of the Scottish Secondary Teachers Association, or SSTA.
Very good. Good afternoon, Mr. Searson.
Good afternoon.
Right, there will be some questions from you by Mr. Stephen, and when you're ready, Mr. Stephen, please start.
I'm obliged, my lord. Could I start by asking you to confirm your full name, please?
It's Seamus Searson.
Thank you. And you've already provided a written statement to the inquiry. For the record, the inquiry reference number for that statement is SCI-WT 0872-5 zeros and a 1. Just to reiterate at the outset that everything you've said in that written statement will be taken into account by the inquiry, even if we don't touch on every single aspect of that in your oral evidence today. And just a gentle reminder that the hearing is being transcribed and there are stenographers taking notes for that purpose, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly. Thank you. So you're here today to give evidence on behalf of the Scottish Secondary Teachers Association, is that correct?
That's right.
I'll call it the SSTA for short, save us some time. Your current role there is General Secretary.
Yes.
And that's a role that you've held since 2015.
Yes.
So during the pandemic. Thank you. What does that role in headline terms entail?
It oversees our membership. Our membership is about 6,000 secondary school teachers. Some of those employed within the local authority, and we'd have members at every position in the school, but only teachers. So we'd have up classroom teachers up to head teachers.
Thank you. And what would you describe as the core aim or objectives of the SSTA?
Well, obviously, it was created to look after the interests of secondary school teachers. When it was established in 1944, it broke away from the EIS because they believed that secondary voices were being lost, so that they created their own union. And the other part, which is really important to me, is secondary education. So that if those two things bind all our members together.
Thank you. And you mentioned you have around 6,000 members. What's the makeup of that membership? How does that
predominantly female membership? Somewhere in the region of 25% of our members would be male, but the majority would be female.
Okay. And I think you say in your statement at paragraph 7 that maybe around 700 members are working in independent schools.
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. I want to turn then first to the closure of schools, if I can start with that. At paragraph 9 of your statement, you say, although there were warning signs at the start of 2020 around COVID, it started to be taken more seriously by the Scottish Government in March 2020. My general view was that there was a real commitment to try and keep the schools open for as long as possible. Just to start with then, what were the feelings being made known to you by your members around that time, just ahead of closure? Given what you've said there about this commitment to try and keep schools open, what were you hearing from SSTA members at that time?
The main part we heard from our members was obviously concern about the exams, because secondary school teachers, that's always been the main focus. So teachers were, if you like, COVID was something that was coming, but they didn't know much about. But what they were concerned about is they were getting prepared for the exams that were taking place during the summer term. And then there was I won't say a panic, but there was a big drive to get as much evidence and prelims together prior to the mid-March. So schools would not normally do prelims, but they thought if the schools are closed, we need to get some evidence together. So the focus from our members was really trying to get the evidence together as best we could for the examinations, should there be no exams in that summer. But what we did find is that the schools were prioritising certain subjects, so therefore subjects like English, maths and sciences were picked up as the priority, and other subjects were, our members were actually saying to us, we're going to be judged on results when we haven't been able to see the children for the last number of weeks.
Thank you, and we will come back to exams. I suppose my question was, what was the general feeling of SST members at that time about the fact that closure was coming? Were there any concerns that were made?
Well, as I said, that was the main concern at that point, because, as I say, we didn't know a great deal about COVID other than the stories that we heard, but the priority from most of our members at the time was actually getting their work done and getting the exams done.
Was there any fear or anxiety from your members, either in relation to themselves or others, with this commitment, as you said, to keep schools open at that time?
Not necessarily prior to mid-March. That really came abundantly clear as soon as lockdown, if you like, the reality hit, that schools were closing, and then there was real fear amongst the members at that point.
Okay. And what were those fears?
A whole range of fears, because obviously, as I mentioned, their exams was one of the big drivers, but then they started to look at themselves and realise that they were putting themselves at risk, particularly their own families. Most people did at that time, weren't really sure what was going to happen. But then people started to, when they took their mind off the education situation and actually looked at themselves and their own families, they realised that not only would they be vulnerable, because members cross all age groups and some would have underlying health conditions, but equally the more concern seemed to be for other members of their family, either children or older parents or uncles and aunts and so on. And that was a real worry for them. So that became more of an issue once the schools actually closed.
Thank you. And what was the SSTA messaging then to its members? What were you saying to them about these fears and anxieties that they had?
We were quite clear that the most important thing was keeping people safe, and particularly as our members, the teachers, because we realised that they could be vulnerable because of the position that they hold, in schools. And we knew there was a drive to try and keep schools open in some way at some point. But as I say, that was the overriding concern that we got to say. Initially, up to March, the concern was about getting their exams done. But after that, it was like a turning point. They started to look and realise, actually, this is real and it's happening. And members were frightened. They really didn't know what was going on. And we were in constant contact with members on the phone, by email, saying to us, XX situations. So we tried to give general advice that would cover all those categories. But the main priority for us was keeping our members safe, and equally the children safe as well.
Thank you. And I think you kindly provided to the inquiry, I think, an example of messaging that you provided to members, an SST message, and that just for I won't go to it, but for the inquiry's record, that's SCI-SSTA, 2 X's dash, then 5 zeros and a 1. You mentioned safety first. Was the SSTA making those same points about safety first to the Scottish Government at that time?
Oh yeah, that was a constant theme of everything we said, because the various groups that were set up, particularly the workforce implementation group, which was a make-up of all the not only teaching unions but education unions. We met with representatives from COSLA, the employers' organisation, and there would be people from the Scottish Government there in attendance as well. We also had people from health and some of the scientific people came to those meetings. But that was the point that we all made from the teacher unions and the non-teaching unions, was trying to keep everybody safe. That was our main concern. And we made that clear right through every opportunity we possibly could. That was our first starting point.
And we won't go into implementation or decision making because that's not the role of this phase, but you mentioned the workforce implementation group. So these fears and anxieties that your members had, that would have been the forum to which you were making those concerns known.
That was the only forum at that stage, and we would have made those representations, and we would have reported back to our members the conversations and reports of those meetings. That was a regular thing. Immediately after each of those meetings, I would send a report out to all our local officers, so they were fully aware of what was going on.
Thank you. Now, paragraph 8 of your statement, I think you state your ultimate belief that the decision to close schools was the correct decision at that time, albeit you go on to say that young carers and children's special schools were a major issue, but your view was that the decision to close was correct.
Well, we did, yeah. There was no, as far as I was concerned, there was no option. Until we knew more about what was going on and put measures in place, that was the only option we could possibly do, was close schools at that point in time, until we could work out what the plan of action would be to try and change that. But to continue schools to run while that was the uncertainty there, we would have had real problems, because the children may have turned up and some of them may not have, and teachers would have been pressurised, and probably is not the right word, pressurised, but felt a duty to go into school even though their own circumstances could be vulnerable. So I think exactly that closing the school was the right, and to review where we were and then put a plan in place for whatever steps we wanted to go forward.
And to be clear, you thought that was the correct decision because of the safety first approach that you've mentioned already?
Yes, most definitely. Yep. It would be no different in terms of there was no running water in the school, or the heating had gone in the middle of the winter. It's an obvious thing. That's the first thing to do. Stop, review where we are, and move forward. So, as far as I was concerned, it would be no different to any of those examples.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned young carers and children with special needs as a major issue. I think we'll come back, time permitting, to children with additional support needs in due course. And the inquiry has helpfully heard evidence already, for example, from Carers Trust Scotland and PAMIS in respect of those. I want to move on then to delivery of teaching or education online or remotely, given the school closures. And at paragraph 29 of your statement, you describe teachers as being in a very poor situation. And you mention a survey of your members that was done by SSTA in the autumn of 2020. And you provided a copy of that to the inquiry, and that's on the SSTA website. But for the inquiry record, the reference to that survey is SCI-SSTA 2X's-5 zeros and a 2, title being Lockdown Learning Depended on Teachers' Resources and Resourcefulness. What was the aim of that survey to start with?
It was, we were getting concerns from members that were asked to deliver online learning. And one, they didn't have the equipment or the training, to actually deliver some of those things. So teachers, being very resourceful, found ways and means to actually do that. But what we were also concerned about is that they didn't have the equipment either. And that was a major concern because, when lockdown took place and online teaching began, there was assumption that teachers were skilled in online, arrangements, which is not the case. Equally, didn't have the equipment to do it either. I mean, it is a major concern in schools anyway. There isn't enough IT equipment for everybody, and we were in a situation where, people were sent home, to work, and we were having to resource as best we possibly could. And what we wanted to find out from our members was how willing or able were the employers to actually provide the equipment necessary. And what we found that they weren't in that position either. So it was really just to reassure people, because what we were getting from members was they were under pressure to get things done, but they didn't have the wherefore to actually do that. So the survey was really to reassure members that we were, as I said, we reported these things to the WIG group, but we just wanted to make it clear that some of the expectations had to be more manageable. But it was a big learning curve for many teachers, and many of them were able to adjust very quickly, which we'd probably expect. But even like the support, in terms of having Wi-Fi that it could use, was an assumption that was made when actually that's not the case at all. But it was something that teachers, I've got to commend them for. They did step up to the mark and do the best they could, but it was varied across the country.
Yeah, thank you. And forgive me, we'll just try and take it in stages, because there's a few things you said there. And so you've explained the aim of the survey. You mentioned earlier on that you have 6,000 members. How many of those were responding to that survey in the first place?
We were very fortunate. We were getting more than 50%, 60% replies to the surveys, and partly because the surveys weren't long, but they were actually relevant to what was going on at the time. So we found that members did respond quite well to those.
And you mentioned some of the findings, but was online teaching an environment with which teachers were familiar prior to that time?
No. It was, there'd only be one or two places in the country where online teaching would, in the rural areas that would have happened. And there are issues over that and how that's been delivered. But the vast majority of teachers would have had no experience of online learning at all.
And you mentioned equipment in passing. Was that something that teachers were all provided with?
No, it was very varied. Some of the equipment, if they got any, was old and wasn't really suitable for the task. There was a reliance that teachers would actually use their own equipment if they had some. And I think that was a real problem, is that we haven't actually moved on from that either since. So, for example, training for online teaching has not taken place since. So if you like preparing for another eventuality or developing online teaching, this would have been an opportunity to start moving in that direction. But we're still struggling in schools, I've mentioned already, to have adequate IT equipment, and most schools complain they don't have the connectivity to actually run some of the equipment if they did have it.
Sticking with equipment, was it your evidence then that teachers were having to source their own equipment rather than that being provided by their institution or local authority?
It was expected. I mean, even one authority made a remark and informed when we made the issue with them that teachers were earning enough money that they should go out and buy their own equipment and that's not what we're at. As employees, if they needed to use certain equipment, it should be provided by the employer.
And what about in terms of impact on workload for teachers? I'm thinking of lesson preparation, etc., in this online environment. What, if any, impact did this shift to online learning have?
Well, normally teachers prepare the work they know they're going to do for the whole year. The scheme of work, the plans are already prepared, and they would be working together. Usually teachers in the same department would be working together, providing materials that they would use with the expectation those materials would be used in class with children, at that time. What we found was that teachers were having to spend a long period of time actually developing new materials that would cover online teaching because we couldn't just lift what we'd normally lift and put into those situations. So a lot of time was spent by teachers developing work, and particularly in terms of those youngsters that were getting ready for exams. There was a real worry that we needed to keep on doing that sort of thing as well. But it would have taken, if you take, for example, a lesson, if it's an hour lesson, you expect to between 1 and 2 hours in preparation for that lesson, and that wouldn't be unusual, but under these circumstances it could have been longer because we had to make sure that whatever materials we produce met the needs of all the youngsters in the class.
Thank you. Just remind you again about the stenographers that will be trying to note down what you say. Just I note your pace is relatively quick, so I'll just remind you of that. Thank you. And I think you said in your earlier answer that teaching was not provided to teachers. Is that correct in terms of delivering in the online environment?
No, there was no training available for teachers. Even when lockdown occurred, there wasn't any training. Nothing took place. So teachers had to be resourceful to actually try and meet those needs.
Thank you. And did that online learning day, in your experience, mirror that of what would have been the case in a normal school environment? Was that the expectation or reality?
It couldn't be. Because the classroom is a unique place to be, and when it's online, the teachers aren't aware of what every youngster is doing or not doing at that particular point in time. And the worry, I think I mentioned it further on, is that teachers were preparing work for some of the youngsters, and as lockdown continued, the youngsters weren't engaging. They might come to the lesson, but they wouldn't complete the work, which was frustrating because in a classroom environment, the teacher would obviously have that contact and build relationships and ensure the youngsters were doing the work. So it was a little bit of a one-way stream.
I think at paragraph 32 of your statement, I think you say common sense would suggest that you'd be better looking for quality rather than quantity in terms of teaching hours online. I think you query whether it would be a productive exercise to stick to regular school hours, if you like.
Well, there was no reason to stick to the regular school hours. Because children didn't have to get from A to B, they were in one place. And often with school situations, the timetable's written to break up the day into reasonable chunks. If during lockdown we had the opportunity that the teachers could actually spend, instead of a 50-minute or a 45-minute lesson, they could actually spend a bit longer. And therefore, it was quite feasible in our view, was that schools would rearrange the timetable to make sure that teachers were available for bigger chunks of the time during the working day. And we did have examples where some schools wanted people sitting at the desks at 8:50 in the morning and staying there to the end of school, but that's not reasonable. It also didn't allow people to prepare lessons because if you're on duty all the time, you can't be doing anything else. And I'm going to add to, you might mention this later, is that some of our members had caring responsibilities as well, and therefore this made it much more unlikely to be able to manage it, whereas if a teacher knew there was commitments for an hour here, an hour there, they could actually work to that and look after their children at the same time.
Yes. Thank you. And yes, you mentioned caring responsibilities. Do you think sufficient allowance was therefore made for those that had those?
That was one of the major problems that we had, is that schools, local authorities, when they started to try and open up the schools, that was a major concern for us, because it was like your duty is to be at work. And in some ways, I'm saying the majority of schools were quite understanding, but there were examples where members were put under pressure to come in, even though they knew they had other caring responsibilities as well. And we had to intervene as best we could as a union to actually say this is not actually a good use. I mean, we advised our members that had caring responsibilities to make themselves available to do online teaching. So they were continuing to work, but I think there was a little bit of fear, well, if A can do it, why can't B do it? But everybody's situation is different. And we thought, people should be understanding of that difficulty.
You used that word pressure, and it appears in other places in your statement. Where, to be clear, is that pressure, do you think, coming from?
In the first instance, it would be pressure from the senior people in the school. But we also believe that there was pressure from those above, in terms of local authorities, to try and keep the schools open, or provide provision, especially for those children that needed to be looked after. So there was pressure down, and I think sometimes the people at top hadn't really realised what was really happening on the ground. As far as they were concerned, their job was to try and keep the schools open, or some parts of the school open, without actually taking into consideration the people that work in there. And as I said, people with an underlying health condition, we were getting calls from members saying, I've been told I've got to come to school, but I'm worried about my own condition. And we were having to intervene and try and make changes to that. But that was the sort of blanket message that was coming out. We want to get things back to normal as soon as we can, and particular children needed to be looked after, and I'm using that word very carefully, rather than taught, that they were looked after by teachers or others in schools.
Thank you. Sticking then just with the situation at IT and equipment just for now, and then we'll move on. And I think you touched on this in one of your earlier answers, is how would you sum up preparedness in Scotland's secondary schools now in respect of IT equipment and infrastructure if there was to be another pandemic?
We'd be in exactly the same position as we were back in 2020. We are struggling to get IT equipment in schools because of the cutbacks that are going on. But if we have a lockdown again, other than the teachers having experience of doing it, there's been no real training or no new equipment made available to do that. So I think we'd be in exactly the same place as we were then.
Thank you. I want to move on now to exams, and you touched on this at the beginning of your evidence, but just to explore that in a bit more detail. In paragraph 58 of your statement, you say that all additional working impact ceased during the pandemic, which was a godsend, and I think there you were talking about inspections, other perhaps bureaucracy, I think is the way you put it. But in paragraph 59, you say that exams were the biggest problem for the SSTA's secondary teacher members and brought the highest demand of work. What were your members being asked to do? Can you elaborate in some more detail as to
As
why
I
that
said,
was the case?
before lockdown took place, teachers were under tremendous pressure to get those youngsters that were going through national qualifications, the senior children, to get evidence together. Nobody knew what evidence would be required. So if you like, it was belt and braces. Everything that could be done was being gathered together in schools prior to that. And that was obviously, as I said, exams for secondary school teachers is how many schools are judged and how the teachers are judged themselves. I mean, each year when the exam results come around, the school gets judged on it, even though we haven't got league tables. That's what appears in the press. And likewise, within a school, the exams of each department is measured against each other. So, that pressure's always been there, and it's been there, and probably will continue for a few more years. But there was that worry that, and I'm going to put that slightly a bit more to that, is it was really about doing the best for the young people. as much as I said about the league tables and whatever, it was really, the teachers didn't want any of the young people to be let down. So whatever they were asked to do or could find ways of doing, they would do it. If there was a school up the road that was doing X, Y, and Z, they would introduce X, Y, and Z because they didn't want to put their youngsters at a disadvantage. So there was real pressure prior to the closed lockdown, and then there was the worry of what was going to come next. And you know, most people probably gauged, and we probably gauged the same, that schools wouldn't be ready for the exams to take place in the summer. And we made that clear back in April. You know, soon after the exam, the schools were closed, that, you know, the likelihood of us being back to any form of normality was remote. And we argued that we needed to get something else in place to actually do the exercise of qualifications that summer. And I've also mentioned that soon afterwards we actually said the same for the following year, because of the break that had taken place, that we should actually be looking at a different model for qualifications in 2021. But I think people didn't. I think there was an assumption that 2021 would all be back to normal, and we were far from that as we were approved at the time. But after, say, when COVID, say when the lockdown took place, there was a drive to get children to produce work. So teachers were setting work, you know, for youngsters to do at home, they could bring in and use as evidence. But at that point, we didn't know what was going to happen or how it was going to be used. So it was really get as much as we possibly can. My worry with all of that was, one, it was a burden on the teachers to try and get all this extra work, but it was the poor young people as well, because they were getting it from 6, 7, 8 different teachers for different exams, all at the same time. And my worry was always, it would have been, you know, those children that would have achieved an A grade would probably get through that quite well. It was the youngsters in the middle band, you know, C to E, would have been the ones that would have been under real pressure to try and get additional work in. And they probably would have struggled anyway. And I think I've mentioned somewhere else is that some of our poor youngsters walked away from it all under the pressure. But when if you say a secondary school situation, each department is putting pressure on youngsters without really making it aware of what pressure in the whole is happening to those youngsters.
Thank you. So just taking that in stages as to what you said, the SSTA was therefore advocating that there be no exams in April, May 2020, and then you say the following year also, but let's just stick with 2020. You said you made that clear. Was that made clear to the Scottish Government?
Yes.
Right. And what was the proposal or alternative that the SSTA was putting forward instead of those? If those exams are cancelled, what was the proposal?
You know, we've always maintained that teachers' professional judgment is the most important thing. And we made it clear during that process that we needed to rely on the teachers to actually give a fair grading for where the youngsters would be at the end of the year. Now, bearing in mind that the teachers would have taught those youngsters for the best part of a year and would have been assessing those on a regular basis. I mentioned prelims and coursework. They would have been done as indicators throughout the period, and the marks for that would be available. I've also argued that we assess youngsters from the minute they walk into secondary school at the age of 11. We assess them 2, 3, 4 times a term in most schools across Scotland. We put grades down, and most parents would see these on a regular basis. I argued that we've got this evidence from the first day they walked into secondary school. Why are we not using this evidence to support where the youngsters would land in the summer? And what basically we were told was, you know, we couldn't do that. We need to do something different. And the alternative certification model was set up, and we weren't part of that. Where we were excluded from that. It was only the EIS that took part on behalf of the teachers because they didn't want too many people around the table. But the outcome of that was that they wanted evidence to prove the teacher's judgment, and that's where, if you like, the change took place, is because the evidence that people had been collecting, some of that was discarded. So that if you can follow the logic of it, people did things that were never going to be used, because nobody knew what was going to happen. So when the alternative ACM came into being, particular evidence was identified, and some schools hadn't done that and would have to change and do that as accordingly. And it's always the worry that people jump the gun and do things too soon. But our argument was, and probably proved in the end of the day right, was that teachers' professional judgment is the best guide for these sort of things. But the SQA and the awarding bodies' evidence is what they rely on. So they would measure what they can measure, whereas teachers would have a much more rounded picture of a young person and probably give a more accurate determination of where they would be.
Thank you. I think you talk in your statement about it being a mad rush, I think is the way you put it, with that material being disregarded, and they talk about a mad rush to get pupils at home to submit their most recent work, I think collect evidence of coursework. What was the impact of that mad rush, as you put it, on the teachers themselves?
Well, this was on top of, if you like, trying to deliver education, online teaching as well, because this was an extra demand. As I said, teachers would plan their year's work. They would have particular points in time where evidence would be collected. And what happened here was that we had a burden of extra evidence for not only the teachers but for the young people at a very critical stage. But it's in some ways the ACM actually has forced a review of the way we do qualifications here in Scotland, and that review is still, the outcome of that is still going on, because what we learnt through the ACM is there are other ways to assess young people, not necessarily just final exams.
Thank you. I want to move on then to the reopening of schools. And at paragraph 80 of your statement, you say that the SSTA surveyed its members from various local authorities following the reopening of schools. And for the inquiries reference, that survey is at SCI-SSTA XX and then dash 5 zeros and a 6, and it's called SSTA Safety First School Return Survey. What did that survey tell you about the confidence of your members in being able to return to reopen schools?
Our members were very worried, prior to the summer term, the summer holidays officially starting, and then worried about what was going to happen when they came back. We were very anxious to actually serve our members prior to them returning to how confident they were that in terms of going back, what safety measures would be in place, because they all know their own workplaces and they knew what had happened during the partial closure of schools. And we asked them a series of questions asking about, are you prepared to go back? Or when I say prepared, are you confident that you'll be kept safe when you get back? And there was a majority of people were saying they weren't very sure of what was going to happen. We followed that up again in September to ask how people responded to that, and it had moved slightly, but those people were still very concerned about what was going, whether I'm going to use the word carefully, that their safety was being taken seriously.
What did that survey tell you about the consistency between local authorities in terms of the, I suppose, either adherence to restrictions, so things like social distancing, or access for teachers to these things they might need, like PPE, face coverings?
It was varied right across each of the 32 authorities, because when we asked members about the survey, we asked them which authority they worked in, so we could gauge which authorities were, I'm going to say, better than others, and some authorities came out quite high up, but others it was very sparse. Any provision of PPE, even adherence to social distancing and other arrangements. But the other problem that we've got in the secondary sector is that some of the things that you think from many of our school days, a teacher would have had a classroom. That's not the case in secondary schools. In many secondary schools now, even brand new schools, teachers are having to share classrooms. So that would have been an issue for teachers going in. Equally, IT equipment would have been shared as well, because each classroom would have a computer to register the children. And if a different teacher came in, precautions had to be taken. So I think the assumption that a teacher goes in the classroom, closes the door, and it's their little environment is far from the truth now. So I was just going to say is that what we heard was that, as I say, some authorities were very, very good, tried to put everything in place. Other authorities, it was less so. And also the number of children that were coming in. In some schools it was 50% of the intake, sometimes it was a bit smaller, but more and more the schools tried to increase the number, which made, from what we knew at the time, the situation a bit more difficult, and transmitting of COVID was more likely.
given that inconsistency that you've talked about, is there anything you would suggest to the inquiry could be done differently in the event of another similar event like this?
Yeah, but I mentioned earlier about the workforce implementation group, the WIG. That group was set up as soon as lockdown took place. Online meetings took place twice a week. And for me, the important part of that was the people sitting around the table on the screen were also in contact with their members, teaching and non-teaching staff. And we were trying to say very similar messages about how our members were feeling in schools. If there's one lesson to be learned, is actually talk to those that represent the people working on the ground and listen to what's been said, because we felt we might have been listened to at some of the meetings, but the local authorities who weren't at the meetings were putting that to one side. I was just teachers whinging again, or whatever it might be. I probably shouldn't have said that, but whinging. But the impression I give you is, but what we should have had was a consistent policy across all the all schools and all local authorities. But what we found was COSLA, even though it represented all the employers, had no power over the local authorities, and it was left to local authorities to determine themselves what was important and what wasn't. So if there is a lesson to be learned, talk to the people that are closest to the ground, but then if you agree something, agree it across the board and implement it across the board, because that was a big failure as far as I was concerned.
Thank you. Now, moving on to the Christmas 2020 period, at paragraph 106 of your statement, you say the big problem for the SSTA came after Christmas. I think you mean Christmas 2020. You say the Scottish Government was prepared to bring pupils back after Christmas. Again, what were the views of your members on that?
Well, it was a combination of things. You probably all recall there was a big drive from Westminster to have everybody celebrate Christmas after we'd been through a whole period of restrictions and so on. Equally, the level of people going down with COVID was increasing towards before Christmas, and then there was the worry about coming back after everybody had been together. Bear in mind what appeared to be a relaxation of the rules over Christmas. I was quite clear, the number of members that contacted me, because unfortunately I was on the emergency call over Christmas, and I was inundated with members contacting the office, messages saying, I'm frightened, what can I do? I'm worried about my family, I'm worried about this, that, and of course the press was also building things up as well. And I spent the Christmas break right into every local authority, to the Deputy First Minister, and putting messages out to members saying we were taking this seriously, and we were trying to put pressure on to actually say we can't open the schools back in January. We need to be ready and pace ourselves back into it. It can't go from a full implementation just because it happens to be January. And I think this is part of the problem, is that a number of people thought COVID would wear itself out. And of course, the medical people and the scientists told us earlier in the year it would soften during the summer months, but it would increase again in the winter months, which it did. So even the advice we were given early on, those that understand this far better than I do, would tell us there'd be peaks and troughs during the year, and the winter time was one of those where it was going to be the most difficult. So, as I said, I was pleased in the end that we were able to delay the return to school, but we would have been a real problem because some of our members, teachers are very compliant. They do as they're asked. And if somebody said, you've got to do this, they more often than not would do it. But we were getting to the stage where people were actually saying, I can't go back. I'm worried about myself, I'm worried about my family, and I don't think I'll be able to go back in. And we knew that would be a bigger problem if they didn't go in when they got back. So, if you like, the pressure was relieved because everybody, the government's actually relaxed that return to school. But I think it was naive to think that we could all go back after that without actually staging ourselves back in. But I think there's political pressures, and unfortunately teachers and schools are stuck in the middle of that sometimes.
And at paragraph 107 of your statement, you give the view of the SSTA that I think the 4 national governments should have been issuing united guidance on the reopening of schools. Why does the SST hold that view? Why would that be advantageous?
I think I've mentioned earlier in my statement is that I'm a bit peculiar. I mean, but, and I'll try and explain that, is that I work in Scotland, I live in Northern Ireland, and my children go to school in Northern Ireland. So I was getting, because of my position, I was listening every day to all the announcements from each of not only the Scottish and Northern Irish government, but Westminster government as well. So in some ways I had quite a unique experience, because whatever was said in one, it had an influence on me at some point as well. So therefore I was able to listen to what was coming out of the three governments. Likewise, because being very close to the Republic of Ireland, I was also monitoring what was going on there. And what surprised me was it wasn't consistent. Yet, if we were dealing it, across the UK, for example, we should have been all following the same rules. But what we found is, or say found is not probably the right word, but my impression is that there was something going on between the various governments, and pressure was being applied. For example, if schools were opening in England full time, the pressure was on. Why is Scotland not doing the same? But remember, in Scotland, we were delaying and returning back to schools. So, from my experience of watching the whole thing very closely, is that there should have been one message that was coming out on behalf of all the governments to make it clear. Because if you wanted consistency and keep everybody safe, which was we should have all been doing exactly the same thing, and that wasn't the case.
Thank you. I said we'd come back to disproportionate impacts. The inquiry is interested in impacts, and indeed disproportionate impacts on those during the pandemic. And in your statement at paragraph 54, you describe pupils with additional support needs, disabilities, and those with English as a second language, and those living in deprived areas, as I think the way you put it is having missed out on their entitlement to education, I think is the way you put it, during the pandemic. Could you please elaborate on why you think that was the case?
Well, normally, I'll say, a number of children with ASN needs rely on specialist support, whether it's a teacher or a classroom assistant or whatever it might be, to help them get through the lessons. That's just, as I say, as an example, and it's typical for the other groups as well, is that they rely on that assistance, but they weren't getting that during lockdown or when schools started to reopen. What they were getting is they were put into a class with children from different ages, different abilities, and they weren't getting that additional help. So therefore, they missed out on that. Equally, what we found was that youngsters from deprived areas, even though there was a drive, because what we tried to do, as a system, was look after the children that were key worker children, but we were also very much aware of those that were vulnerable, in the communities, and we wanted to get them brought in as well as best we could. And what we found is that we weren't getting those coming into school either, even though the provision was made set aside for them to come in. Is that those children, even though they were identified and encouraged to attend, weren't coming to school. So therefore, they were missing out on potentially additional help that we could have given them. They were probably exactly the same children that weren't joining in online learning either. And therefore, because if they didn't have somebody there to support them directly, then they would get further. That's the assumption is they had the equipment anyway, to actually engage. So that whole period, if you like, the disparity between the mainstream and those other children, it widened during that period. And that's why I think when we wanted to get back to, I wouldn't say normal, but back in, we were very keen that additional support should come in to support those most vulnerable children from as soon as school started to go back. And I think that was the intention of the Scottish Government. They put money aside for giving additional support, but we didn't see as much of it as we probably would have liked to have seen.
Thank you. Moving on then to hub schools, if I can. In paragraph 35, you say that teachers were not teaching, but rather they were child-minding. And then again, at paragraph 41 of your statement, you describe hubs as really just child-minding facilities. That description that you give, why do you give it, and is that consistent with what the SSTA thought the purpose of these hubs was?
Well, as I said, the hubs were for key worker children, and those vulnerable children, various groups which we've mentioned. But if you put that, a teacher in a secondary school teaching English would have children of a similar age all at the same time and would prepare work for that particular group. During the hubs, the groups would be trying to match as best they could children of a similar age, but that wasn't the case. There was mixed age groups. It could have been a mixed age groups from all secondary children in one group, and maybe all primary as well, because they were, hubs became centres for not just the secondary school but some of the primary schools as well. And teachers would be asked to support them, and they would set some work. But bear in mind, some of the youngsters were probably out of their age group. If a primary youngster was in the class and a secondary teacher was teaching them, it may not be the ideal fit. But what teachers were, they did the best they could with the youngster in front of them. But mirroring that group could change from day to day. So it was very much one-off lessons, so therefore teachers would try and find a piece of work that would accommodate a range of age groups all at the same time. So therefore it wouldn't have been the normal teaching, whereas the teachers that were teaching online, would have been teaching their subject to the right age group, whereas the hubs, it was like a holding exercise, and that's why I say child minding, because it was just keeping them safe and giving them some work to do and making sure they got fed at the appropriate point in time, and teachers sort of did their best as they could in those circumstances.
And was that satisfactory in your view then, that approach that you've just described?
Well, it's the only manageable approach. If we want to bring the look after key workers and vulnerable children, then all we can do is your best on that circumstance. The group sizes probably, because remember we're still trying to do social distancing as well when these youngsters are in, and some teachers would have found that very difficult with some children that need to be very close to people. But under the circumstance, I think teachers did a marvellous job to actually try and look after the children as best they possibly could. But I think and I've been honest enough in saying it was child minding, looking after children rather than teaching them.
Thank you. Paragraph 42 of your statement, you say that members made the SST aware of children who should be attending these hubs but were not. What was the reason or reasons behind that?
I think as much as the hubs were available, I think some of the key workers in the first instance were unsure the children would be safe during COVID, and therefore, even though the facility was available to them, some of them didn't make those arrangements. I also think that some of the youngsters would have realised, the vulnerable youngsters probably thought, well, I'll go there, but I'm actually not learning a lot, or I'm not doing a lot, and I'd rather be at home, and so they voted with their feet. So I think putting hubs in place or places for youngsters to go was the right decision to do. But I think the only thing we'd probably look at now in future is what would we do if we had the same scenario again. I'm not sure we've got any plans in place for that, but there might be a better use of teachers, because in some instances would it have been better for teachers to stay at home teaching online and bringing other people to come in and support those youngsters. But that's something for future discussion.
Thank you. Finally, I wanted to touch on transitions briefly. At paragraph 91 of your statement, you say that members told the SSTA that pupils transitioning to secondary from primary school were not ready for that transition. Can you elaborate on why there was that lack of readiness?
I think I'll take it for those youngsters that were moving from primary schools would have missed that last part of the year where they prepare themselves to move to secondary schools. Activities that take place in primary schools at the end of the school year, extracurricular journeys away from school, trips. Most schools tended to have that at the end, during the summer term. And part of that is getting them ready to move towards a secondary school. They would have also visited the secondary schools prior to that happening and got a flavour of what was going on, and likewise. And that particular period was lost to those youngsters. And obviously, how many of them were working during COVID, during that period is debatable as well. But if you like, the order and rhythm was broken, And what we found is when the youngsters came into secondary school, they didn't all come in all at the same time because of the staging process. And some of the things that we would normally do in the secondary school to, I'm going to put it, I won't say, just to get how things are done, what's expected of them, because going from a primary school environment to a secondary school environment is very different. And what we found from our members was that period of induction, is probably the best way of putting it, was missed. So some of the things that we would have expected as secondary school teachers weren't in place, partly because of the phased return, but equally because the youngsters hadn't been prepared coming from primary school. So therefore, what we asked members about this as well, and members were saying to us that they've missed. It appeared to be a short number of months, but actually it was quite an important part of their learning and maturing going into secondary schools, and that was lost. So we've got reports from members after that, even at the end of the year, saying this has been a very difficult year. The youngsters have not been understand how secondary schools work, and also teachers were trying to make allowances for youngsters that had missed education. And then we were all advising members, they're not going to be the same as you've always had in the past. We need to give a bit more latitude to different ways of behaviour and try and work on that. But we're still seeing some of the examples of that going up through the system now, is where youngsters are moving up to their exam years, have missed out on so much. And it's one of the things that we've argued why we wanted the exams to stay with the ACM model rather than return to the main model, is that the youngsters weren't ready. And I think there's an assumption they're in school, they must have been ready, but if you miss a big chunk of time, then that would be a real problem. I will go on to say one of the things in hindsight that I wish that we'd actually set back the clock and actually made every year go back one and restart again, because that's such a valuable time. I think the amount of stuff that we've had to pick up as a consequence of running forward is at the disadvantage of the young people. And I can say that in hindsight, but looking back on it, that might have been a better way to actually prepare youngsters for the transition. Support them for the time they'd missed and make them better prepared to move into secondary school and equally up through the exams as well.
So that's an impact you think is still being felt?
Oh yeah,
now?
very much so.
Okay. Thank you. To the extent not covered already, are there any other, whether it's lessons learned or other particular issues that you'd like to bring to the attention of the inquiry before we conclude?
I just think we need to be ready for something like this happening again. If you take, for example, the reinforced concrete problems that have arisen in certain school buildings, there was no plans in place for that, something like that to happen. And I think it's something, there will be something again in the future. So I just think there needs to be a strategy in place of what's important and have measures in place to move on that in the future, because I hope COVID doesn't come back or some variation of it, but I would like to think that we're actually putting a bit of forward planning in the eventuality of something like this occurring.
Thank you. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for this witness, subject to anything you wish to add or to ask.
Oh, nothing to add or ask. Thank you very much, Mr. Searson. And thank you, Mr. Stephen. 2:45, Mr. Stephen?
Yes, my Lord.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Ms van der Vesterhuizen. Now, you have another witness for us?
I do, yes, my lord. We have Miss Senior, who is the Scotland official of the University and College Union.
Very good. Good afternoon, Miss Senior.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Very good. Miss van der Vesterhuizen will have some questions for you.
Thank you,
So,
my lord.
when you're ready.
Thank you. Miss Senior, please could you confirm your full names?
Yeah, my full name is Mary Jane Senior.
And you gave a witness statement to the inquiry. My lord, that statement can be found using witness reference WT0246. Ms. Senior, you're employed as a Scotland official of UCU, and you have been since 2009. Please could you tell the inquiry what that role entails, both in general terms and also during the pandemic, please?
I'm the lead person for the University and College Union in Scotland, so that means I'm responsible for our representational work, representing individual members, negotiating with employers, also our policy and campaigning and organisational work. So that role continued during the pandemic, and I suppose at that time it involved a lot of engagement with Scottish Government and with employers on the issues relating to the pandemic.
Thank you. And could you now please tell us a little bit about a UCU as a trade union, including its aims and its membership size and composition, please?
Yeah, so the University and College Union, we're a trade union with the largest trade union that works in the post-16 education sector across the UK. In Scotland, our membership is concentrated in the higher education sector, that's in universities. Our members are organised into branches based around universities and institutions. So my role involves all of those branches based in Scotland. Should I say a bit about our membership?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So our members are academic and academic related and professional support staff. So academic staff means lecturers, professors, researchers, and professional support staff and academic related staff would be those staff supporting academics, such as librarians, administrators, IT staff, equality officers, student support workers, and so forth in universities.
And what is the approximate size of your current membership?
Across the UK we've got over 120,000 members, and in Scotland we have around 9,000 members, and that was, the numbers are similar from the period of the pandemic.
Thank you. And despite the name, you say in paragraph 11, and you've already indicated that you don't organise in further education in Scotland's colleges. That's right?
Yeah, that's true. As I say, in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, we do organise in the college sector, and we also organise in the prison education sector in England, but in Scotland, just the different setup. The EIS organises college lecturers, and Unison Unite organise support staff in colleges.
Thank you. And then in normal or non-pandemic times, how does UCU liaise with its membership in order to hear and ascertain their views and their concerns?
Yeah, so as a trade union, we're very democratic, and we have a branch structure, so members can feed views through their branch with elected branch president, secretary, and we have an executive committee in Scotland that meets 4 or 5 times a year. We have an annual congress, which is policy making. So, like all trade unions, we're very democratic in terms of our members have a say in the policies and the actions and the positions we take on a whole range of issues, and that continued to be the case during the pandemic. We were due to have our annual Scotland Congress was due to be round about the 20th, late 20s of March 2020. That was going to be in person. It was postponed, but we moved to holding meetings and our congresses remotely for the duration of the pandemic. So there was a lot of engagement during the pandemic with our members. So members were very much feeding into the positions that we were taking, and when we responded to Scottish Government consultations, you know, our membership views were reflected in all of the things that the representations we made to government at that time.
And practically, I think you said it goes through their representatives, so it's not a case of undertaking polls or surveys or anything, it's purely fed through.
It can be both, but in terms of like Congress and regular meetings, yeah, it would be through branch representatives. But we do polls and surveys of members, and I think we refer to one in our statement, because in July 2021 we did do a survey of members on their experiences to date of the pandemic, and to really double check what we were requesting of government sort of moving into the academic year, which would have been from September 2021. So so I think that poll, and as I say, it's in our evidence, was really important, because I think it reinforced that our messaging and our policy positions were well reflected from our membership, and it helped moving forward.
Thank you. You set out in paragraph 12 of your witness statement that the overriding issue for UCU Scotland and its members during the pandemic was safety, which underpinned all aspects of our work. When you say safety there, do you mean safety in the sense of being safe from the risk of COVID or something else?
Yeah, I mean, the safety and well-being of our members who were the staff in university, but also students too. You know, I think it was a time when we saw the virus was killing thousands of people, and, you know, thousands of people in Scotland, the UK and across the world were becoming unwell and dying. So there was this great unknown. So, you know, as a trade union, keeping our members safe is, you know, a first priority. And, you know, I think when the pandemic hit, you know, it was unknown how it was initially spreading. We didn't fully understand mitigations. There were no vaccines. It wasn't clear what was helping people to recover, who did recover from the virus. So, you know, it was an incredibly frightening time. You know, universities are places where people work closely together. Students come, you know, from, you know, across the world, across Scotland to get together. So there was a real fear that the virus could spread exponentially in a university environment. So, you know, the need to keep people safe was absolutely fundamental for us.
Thank you. And then in terms of your key objectives guiding UCU Scotland's work, you say in paragraph 13, you set out the 4 key objectives that guided UCU's work during the pandemic. And they were safety first, prioritising the safety and well-being of students and workers. 2, protecting jobs, terms and conditions. 3, supporting and protecting the most vulnerable. And 4, prioritising learning and learners. And you say that this safety first approach underpinned all your work and policies. Did you at any time consider that these key objectives, any of them might be in conflict with each other?
I mean, it was an incredibly challenging time. So I think, you know, yes, there were tensions there. I think for us, you know, it was clearly very important that we kept people safe and well, and people weren't exposed to the virus. And, you know, and clearly the lockdowns were designed to do that. And you'll see that our second priority was around the impact this was having on jobs, terms and conditions. And I think we were very aware that the lockdown, and where a lot of university activities were restricted, was creating this threat. UCU, at UK level, we commissioned London Economics to do a survey of the financial impact that the pandemic was having, and it was phenomenal, and this was, I suppose, the risk that universities rely to a great extent on international student tuition fee income, and there was a real fear that by moving online, this fee income would be in jeopardy. The commercial activities of universities in terms of their residencies, cafes and so forth on campus, the accommodation. So there was a real risk that this financial potential catastrophe would threaten jobs and livelihoods. So I guess there was that tension there, and for us it was looking to government, especially UK government, because I guess we were aware the UK government had greater borrowing powers to come in with a rescue package for universities. And clearly we also lobbied the Scottish government on that, and to a certain extent they were able to provide some financial support to universities at this time. But as I say, I think the safety, ensuring people's lives were safe was absolutely the priority. But yes, as you say, there were tensions between those aims.
So is there sort of a hierarchy? Would that have been at the top?
Yes, and you'll see that as we say, we were unashamedly safety first. That clearly there's no point in prioritising jobs if people are dying. We absolutely need to protect life and limb.
So, for example, we have heard some evidence in relation to, for example, impacts on students, including things such as digital poverty and impacts or disproportionate impacts on certain students, more vulnerable students, for example, with additional support needs, or students maybe from lower socioeconomic situations. So how did UCU reconcile those?
I mean, like, one of our priorities is really supporting and protecting those most vulnerable to COVID-19, and I think that there's a lot of people. We're aware that the virus impacted on some people, and some people were more vulnerable to it than others. Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities were getting the virus and dying at higher rates than white communities. So clearly it was vital that we equality impact assessed everything we did, and we kept those people safe. Older people, disabled people were more at risk from becoming more unwell or dying from the virus than others. So so for us, it was essential that they were supported. And you didn't just have to be one of those people. You could have been a carer or a partner or a child or whatever in your household. So, this was a really complex situation, and it was absolutely critical that everyone was supported. And you mentioned digital poverty, and we absolutely supported greater resource being there to ensure that everyone could have access online, laptops and facilities. But inevitably it was incredibly challenging, for everyone. Even you might be in a relatively well-off household, but during lockdown, you might have been trying to homeschool your children, do your day job if you were a lecturer, and it was an incredibly difficult period for everyone.
You say in, I think, paragraph 57 that UCU was supportive of the Scottish Government's four harms approach. I suppose what you were doing there with your priorities is not too dissimilar. What you were supportive of it. Would you care to elaborate on it? How supportive? Would you have recommended a similar hierarchy of harms in the Scottish Government's exercise of the balancing of harms?
Yeah, I think so, and I guess you'll see that from our objectives, I guess we had a hierarchy to a certain extent, and I think it was absolutely critical that we recognise the tremendous impact this was having on people's lives. So I think it was a useful way of measuring impact and trying to prioritise in what was just an incredibly challenging period.
In paragraphs 14 to 17, you discuss the steps taken by UCU to advocate for the closure of university campuses. And in paragraph 14, you set out that on the 17th of March 2020, there were concerns about the spread of COVID, and UCU wrote to Richard Lochhead, who was the then Minister of Further and Higher Education, urging the Scottish Government to close functions of universities that could be closed. What was it that prompted UCU to do this at the time? In other words, was it information from the Scottish Government, or was it media reports of the virus spread, or what was it that prompted that step to be taken?
Do you know, I think it was like everything that was happening at the time, because we were very aware of the pandemic spreading, certainly in Italy, in other places in the world. It was becoming an incredibly worrying situation. I mean, we'd been advising our members around self-isolation and with no detriment, to ensure that people weren't penalised if they were unwell at that time. But it was very clear this was becoming a massive phenomenon, and so at a UK level, our General Secretary had written to the UK government and employers, and we wrote to the Scottish Government, recognising that it wasn't possible for universities to close completely, particularly where they had student residencies, and for many students, their university accommodation was their home. So it would be impossible to close everything down completely. There were also medical research facilities, veterinary schools and so forth that, that couldn't be closed, but that it was possible to do lots of things remotely in terms of online classes and shifting tutorials and that sort of engagement online. So, it was becoming clear that, as I say, I think universities, because staff come from a wide geographical area, and students do. And I think this became more apparent throughout the pandemic. People from across the UK and even further afield were coming to mix in close proximity on a university campus, and so it was really crucial that you did as much as possible remotely when the pandemic was so live.
And you mentioned that you advised your members on certain things. What was the nature of the anxiety? Were they feeding their anxieties to you as well at that stage?
Yeah, no, they absolutely were, and being really concerned about gathering in large numbers on campus. So trying to minimise that, to minimise the use of public transport, and to keep people safe, and that safety first approach that we advocated throughout. You go on then to explain that the Scottish Government responded to UCU advising that it had set up the Advanced Learning Ministerial Leadership Group. Was UCU part of that group at all? Yes, so we were represented on that group along with other campus unions, the Funding Council, employers, key stakeholders, and I think that was it was chaired by the Minister. It met every couple of weeks at times when the virus was more significant or uncertain. We maybe met more frequently, and it was a really good way of the stakeholders getting together and discussing what was happening, and to be able to be taking decisions and advising on guidance for the sector. The National Union of Students were also involved, so. It was a good approach. We also heard from, the government set up an expert advisory group who were also represented on the ministerial leadership group, and later in the pandemic it became the COVID recovery group. I would say it was a really useful forum for us to hear and for them to hear the concerns of our members. So yes.
Thank you. We can turn now to have a discussion about remote learning and teaching, and initially the shift to online delivery and challenges for staff. You state at paragraph 18 of your witness statement that both staff and students reported issues when working from home. Could you please expand on this? First, in relation to staff, what sorts of issues were they reporting?
Yeah, I guess I touched on this a bit earlier. So, I think it really depended upon your personal circumstances. And this was a time when schools were closed too. So you would have, generations all competing for, broadband width, space in your house. If you had young children and you were also trying to deliver a lecture or support students, it was particularly challenging. Very aware, like early careers members who might have also been sharing, an accommodation. If you were at the start of your career, you'd be in a shared flat, so very limited space as well as broadband. So these things were, challenging for for everyone, and our members reported really. Increasing workloads at that time too.
And the workload there, was that because they were having to deliver something different to what they would normally deliver in person, or was that to do with their caring responsibilities, or a bit of both?
Everything, yeah. I think absolutely everything. I think. I suppose if I can, our survey in 2021 really showed the exponential increase in workload that our members experienced, and I think moving to working online is, particularly in a university setting, is so different. And people were having like back-to-back lectures, meetings, tutorials. In some ways, being able to deliver remotely could have been an advantage for students, that maybe students that weren't as confident to ask a question in a big lecture theatre, putting it in the chat, or asking a question remotely was potentially easier. But if you're the lecturer monitoring hands, chat, then moving to the next class, and you're not walking between room meetings, you're just clicking a mouse to move between meetings, and I think faced with the issues and concerns that students were presenting, because they were tremendous and wide-ranging. We've sort of seen the challenging mental health and well-being issues that students and staff had. So I think the workloads increased so considerably. Our survey showed they increased particularly for our members that delivered teaching and research staff. It was an incredibly difficult time.
And do you know what support, if any, was provided to staff to help them transition to virtual platforms and implement online teaching, either by the universities or by the union?
Yeah, I think staff did feel supported. I mean, one of the things I'd say, in July 2021, when we asked our members how supported they felt from employers, 68% of our members, responding, and it was a good sample of members, said they felt either somewhat supported or very supported, and they felt supported with home working. From the employers, which we felt was a good thing. I think that's not to say that it wasn't challenging, and those challenges in terms of the boundaries between caring responsibilities, home life and work, just got tremendously blurred. It was a really difficult period.
And if you could possibly just comment then, because you said both staff and students reported issues with working from home, just turn to expand upon the issues that the students were reporting. What sort of issues did they have?
Issues around digital poverty and access to devices to engage on. I know support did come in fairly quickly from the Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council, but also, space, accessing Wi-Fi and broadband. It was a really difficult time.
And just in terms of workload and stress, I take it from your previous answer that your members were delivering online lessons, they weren't accustomed to teaching that way. Was that entirely new to them, or were some of them more familiar with it than others?
Yes, some would have been more familiar. Do you know, it was an interesting issue for us as a trade union because I guess recorded lectures was an issue that was gradually coming in, and yeah, there were lots of issues in relation to performance right, copyright, and all of those things. And, you know, we'd negotiated with a number of employers around different policies, but the pandemic hit and then we just had to shift wholesale online. So there would have been some familiarity, but to do it, you know, in such a focused and, you know, in a very stressful way, you know, it was... you know, it wasn't without its challenges, shall I say.
And just how did this essentially new way or mode of delivery of education impact on them?
Yeah,
I mean, their workload in particular.
Yeah, I get it. Well, it brings additional pressures. You know, I think I sort of, you know, said some of that about in terms of timing, the back-to-back nature of the demands that were placed upon them. You know, there would have also been a lot of engagement with students requesting one-to-ones and the additional support that students were demanding. So yeah, an incredibly stressful time for our members.
And again, just in relation to student stress and workload issues, do you have any information about that? You've mentioned digital poverty and sort of the stress of, you know, the circumstances, but in terms of the actual workload on students, did you have any information about that workload and the associated stress for students?
Not really. Other than to say, I mean, it was very apparent that it was because of the uncertainty with the pandemic. It was clearly a stressful time for students, and we've seen an increase in demands around mental health and well-being services that students are, you know, are needing.
And just in relation to the additional caring responsibilities, were the children of your members who were teaching in universities provided with hub school places for their children in either the first or the second lockdown?
No, I mean, university staff weren't considered to be key workers in that way. So, you know, unless there were extreme or special circumstances, no, our members wouldn't have accessed, you know, school hubs at that time. You know, I don't think that was an issue that we pushed because, you know, I think we recognised that, you know, people working in the, you know, frontline healthcare workers, you know, I think it was more apparent that who, you know, the key workers were at that time. And as a trade union, we certainly weren't pushing that our members were key workers in that sense because, you know, it was possible to deliver remotely.
And did UCU raise any concerns about staff or members having to balance teaching, research and caring responsibilities from home with anyone?
Yeah, I mean, we were very aware of the, you know, increased, well, you know, juggling so many demands, and, you know, and I think we saw the Times Higher Education, you know, a leading publication in our sector, has covered numerous reports that has looked at career trajectories, and researchers are noting that parenthood, those with caring responsibilities, whether it was for school-aged children or older dependents, there was a real impact upon their research work during that time, with particularly, you know, women who, you know, tend to bear the brunt of caring responsibilities. The number of publications, research publications by women at that time reportedly declined because of having to juggle other responsibilities, and that then clearly had an impact upon career trajectories of parents.
Thank you. You've touched on it already, so we won't take too long, but on digital inclusion, you mentioned at paragraph 18 impacts related to what we're terming digital inclusion. in other words, that some staff were competing with others within their home for broadband. In terms of devices, to what extent was the lack of devices amongst your members an issue? And if so, what steps were taken by their employers to alleviate that?
Yeah, do you know, that wasn't an issue for our members. Generally, you know, they would have had laptops, and universities were supportive in terms of providing additional equipment, whether that might have been screens, and I know some of our members who have a disability, you know, the employer was able to courier equipment to their home. So, you know, employers were supportive, and I think, referring to our survey, you know, we asked members how supportive were employers, and it was on home working that they felt supported by their employers.
And you've touched already on broadband and the issue of broadband. To what extent was the reason for lack of broadband, or to what extent was a lack of broadband an issue for your members, and if and where it was an issue, was that to do with location, or was it to do with affordability, or what were the issues in relation to broadband?
I think it would be coverage, and, you know, I think at the time calling, we were all on meetings where people would, you know, lose reception or whatever, but it might have also been, particularly at the time during the lockdown, you know, if you had, you know, your children were trying to be online, engaging with their schoolwork, or, you know, to parents at home, you know, it was challenging to get enough broadband width for everyone to be able to deliver what they needed to do at that time.
And just around the time of lockdown, when everyone was having to work from home and off devices, what concerns, if any, did your members raise in relation to, or were you aware of, in relation to students' digital inclusion?
Yeah, I guess what I've said already in terms of digital poverty, access to Wi-Fi and broadband, we know it was challenging for students.
If we could then perhaps turn to consider impacts on particular cohorts of staff. The inquiry is very interested in hearing in particular about disproportionate impacts. In paragraph 20, you say that all representations made by UCU to the Scottish Government highlighted concerns about the most vulnerable.
Yeah,
So I was just going to say, was that representations about vulnerable staff or students, or both?
Both staff and students. So, you know, as I said before, it was a safety-first approach, and when people were gradually returning to campus, I mean, there was a point where, as I say, not everyone had had a vaccine, the virus was still spreading, people were still dying, so for us it was really important that people who were more vulnerable to COVID were kept safe, whether that was them as a staff member or a student, or if you as a staff member had a partner at home or a carer or a child at home. You know, for us, you know, that it was that's why the mitigations, keeping people safe, was so important.
And was UCU hearing concerns directly from those who were considered to be more susceptible to COVID-19 about their level of risk or safety in the workplace?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was a time that, you know, many people might have been shielding, or you might have had a member of your household who was shielding. So, you know, it was really important to us that people weren't put at risk of, you know, dying from the virus unnecessarily. Or, I mean, I think we were also very much aware later on in terms of long COVID and the, you know, the really debilitating impact that long COVID was having on people. So, again, for us, you know, minimising any risk of exposure to the virus was really crucial.
And you've mentioned already those in early career roles. At paragraph 21, you refer to women and Black, Asian, minority ethnic workers in early career roles or non-promoted positions. When you say early career roles, what sort of roles are you thinking about in the context of universities?
So they might be postgraduate researchers, tutors, so people at the early stage of their career. There may be new lecturers, and I think as particularly sort of later in the pandemic, as we were gradually opening up, it was, we were aware that people that might have been more established, professors who did less teaching, had more flexibility to continue to work from home, whereas people who may need to deliver tutorials or undergraduate lectures, there was more pressure on them to return to campus, so just aware that there's more BME people in those roles, and we were also aware from the statistics of people that were dying or getting the virus, BME groups were overrepresented in those roles. So again, just trying to ensure that people weren't unnecessarily exposed and vulnerable to the virus or taking it back to their households was really crucial to us.
Thank you. And then we turn now to impacts on particular cohorts of students. You refer in paragraph 25 to student support and progression. To student support and progression being crucial issues during the pandemic, where disruption to studies, to practical work and placements, and to exams and assessments had the potential to create problems for students and their ability to progress to the next stages of their learning or career. What were the implications of the shift to virtual platforms for specifically the delivery of practical lab-based or placement-based subjects, which I think you discuss at paragraph 25, and in particular, what were your members telling you about this?
I guess it just made it more challenging to ensure that people were gaining the skills to progress. But I would say that I think our members and the employers worked together really effectively to be as creative as possible to ensure that standards were met and that students could progress, because I think we knew that students were getting a very different learning experience to the one that students had received at university up to that point. But we didn't want them to lose time and to be held back. So the sector generally worked incredibly hard and effectively with all the key stakeholders. I said there that there was a subgroup of our COVID recovery group which specifically looked at the COVID learner journey, which was designed to ensure that there weren't any blockages, that students were able to progress, and that we were part of that group along with the NUS, with employers. And that generally did work, and it was only in a very few disciplines, dentistry being the one that I'm aware of, and we know, we've got members that deliver that lecture in that discipline, and students in dentistry just weren't able to progress to the next year, and so the Scottish Government provided additional funding so that those students in effect were sort of repeating a year, because I suppose the procedures, and it related to the aerosol techniques that they needed to do, they weren't able to get that in-person experience, and so that they were sort of held back a year, had to. Those students ended up doing extra, different cohorts of them ended up having to do extra years, and the funding was provided to support that.
So thank you. We've heard from other witnesses about placement-based learning in particular having stopped, but we'd be interested to hear from the union on what your understanding was of the impact on learners. You've obviously mentioned dentistry, but were there any other delays in graduating or anything in relation to diminished learning experience that was being reported by your members?
Well, I think, as I've said, our members and the sector worked really hard to ensure that students met standards and were able to progress and to use, you know, creative ways to do so. I think that, you know, that's what I would say.
And were there any difficulties for staff or your members in terms of being able to deliver practical courses? You know, what steps did they take to accommodate that?
Yeah, so lots of things just shifted online, done virtually, or you know, had to be delayed to a sort of later part of the course where the pandemic was, you know, where it was safer, and use different mitigations. So that's what's happened.
Thank you. And in terms of the impact on assessments, we've heard a little bit about that. What do you understand the position to have been in relation to assessments and the extent to which they were conducted in a different way?
Yeah, so I suppose many assessments were able to be done remotely, or we were able to use work that had been done you know, learning that had already been done and had been assessed. So, yeah, as I say, I think the sector worked really creatively to enable students to progress and to assess learning that had been done, so that students could progress.
And just you've mentioned dentistry in the context of progression. We've heard it from a number of sources. Do you have any inkling as to why that was the only impact? Why that it was only dentistry that was impacted in terms of progression, rather than other professions where placement-based learning is essential for?
I think it's because, well, I'm told it's because of the aerosol techniques that students would need to have experience of, and they, you know, weren't able to do this. I mean, I guess we all remember we couldn't go to our dentists, so you know, students were unable to do the placements in the same way. So yes, they couldn't progress.
Thank you. If we could turn on now to consider the communication of impacts to the Scottish Government by UCU. We've already discussed that paragraphs 12 to 13, UCU, you say that you took an unashamedly safety-first approach throughout the pandemic with safety and well-being as overriding priorities. How did UCU Scotland communicate the need for a safety-first approach to the Scottish Government during the pandemic?
So I've mentioned before, we had the ministerial leadership group, which became the COVID recovery group. There were a number of subgroups. So we attended these. Initially, they were by phone conference. They then were on Teams. So, you know, we were able to ask questions, make representations at those meetings. The Scottish Government consulted, you know, on a lot of documents and a lot of guidance. So when we would have been giving our views, some of those would have been in meetings, some of those would have been by email. We also wrote to the Scottish Government, and, you know, I think we've made all of our communications available to the inquiry if you want to see them. So yeah, there was a lot of engagement, and you know, I think we became more effective, or the Scottish Government became more effective and efficient in that as the pandemic progressed. But yeah, we definitely had the opportunity to you know, comment and put in our positions.
If we could now turn to something that you've mentioned already, and it was the concerns about funding for universities, and you discussed this at paragraph 45 to 46. You've already touched on this early on in your evidence in relation to the sort of balancing of harms, or the prioritisation of the key priorities. Could you please just explain the funding challenges and concerns about retention of staff that UCU helped?
Yeah, no, I think this is really important because a lot of staff in the university sector are on precarious contracts, whether this is fixed-term contracts that are related to research grants. There's also a lot of staff on fixed-term contracts or hourly paid contracts related to teaching. And so in terms of the fixed-term research funding, I mean, we were really worried that when lockdown happened, that the staff couldn't continue with their research. I mean, some could, but not all could. And the grant was for a certain period, fixed period of time. So what was going to happen? Were these people going to be laid off? It was a deeply worrying time. And for staff that were on guaranteed hours, contracts or fixed term related to teaching, again it was really worrying if they weren't able to do the teaching or the tutorials and what would happen there. So when March 2020 we were incredibly worried about the situation, the jobs for staff, and we also wanted to keep these people safe. So yeah, and I think as the statement refers to the London Economics report that we did. University Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council had also undertaken some research, and they were raising similar concerns really about the vulnerability of the sector. I guess what happened is that fairly quickly, I think in May 2020, the Scottish Government were able to give some additional funding to the sector in Scotland, and we were very pleased because the Scottish Funding Council, when it allocated the funding, it was £75 million for research, and it was specifically to support PhD students and early careers research staff. So we really welcomed their focus on early careers and PhD students, because these were the people that we were really worried that they were just going to be let go, or you would lose their experience and expertise from the sector. So that was really important.
And just in terms of communication with the Scottish Government, how was that those funding challenges and concerns communicated? Was that through a group, or was that through correspondence?
Yeah, I think it would have been both. That we were sharing these messages. We were meeting regularly. The minister would also meet from time to time with the campus unions, and we had the opportunity to raise these points with him.
And looking back now, does the UCU consider the Scottish Government's funding support to have been sufficient to address the financial pressures and protect jobs?
It was really important. I guess you're asking me as a trade unionist, I think we've for a while we've had concerns about the underfunding of teaching. The sector's got funding challenges. So if you're saying would I have wanted more, yes, I would have wanted more. I think it was important at the time, and it was really crucial that they targeted it at PhD students and early careers research staff. That was very important.
Okay. In paragraph 30, you say throughout the pandemic there was a lot of communication and engagement between stakeholders, and that UCU put in numerous responses and submissions to the Scottish Government. Do you have any examples, or can you describe any instances where UCU Scotland's views and recommendations differed from those of employers or other stakeholders in discussions with the Scottish Government?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a few times. So over the summer of 2020, getting ready for the new academic year, we had a safety first approach, and we were advocating that it should be default remote working and learning. So that meant that where it was possible to deliver activity remotely, that's the way it should happen. And I think we were deeply concerned then that well, we'd seen various iterations of the guidance. Then when it was published around about the 1st of September, that default remote learning had disappeared, which was, really worrying to us. And, and I think how things played out at the start of the academic year into September, it wasn't a happy time because, we did see the virus experienced by lots of students. We then saw students that had to self-isolate in multiple occupancy student accommodation, which was incredibly difficult. So you had students that were unwell. There were all, lots of students in one student flat, for example, sharing bathrooms and kitchens. It was a really challenging time. And for me, I think this underlined why our safety first approach was important, because because the result in September 2020 was, students being told to stay at home, to the virus spreading, and students didn't have the support that they might have done if they hadn't been this rush back to campuses and to students in student accommodation, which was often cramped and uncomfortable, and being unwell from the pandemic. So I think that was a really difficult time. I guess, I mean, in 2021, again, I suppose we had various different. We had like the Delta version of the pandemic, and it was incredibly difficult. And I guess there was pressure on the government from the university employers to open up, but I think it was clear that it was really important that we had mitigations in place. So we were always advocating safety first, to ensure that we got good ventilation, that we had face coverings, that we had 2 metre social distancing, because if you were operating spaces more safely, it was more likely that you could have reduced occupancy, and things would be better, and you could then open up more slowly and gradually, successfully. And I think we felt concerned when employers were wanting to reduce the restrictions, because this was going to this wasn't going to end up it wasn't going to be a good outcome, because it was going to mean that you were going to have an environment where the virus was going to spread. So that was incredibly difficult.
And were there some, what were some of the key areas of disagreement or tension between UCU and the Scottish Government, and how were those navigated?
I'm not... I feel like the Scottish Government was sort of more a sort of arbitrator between us and employers who were wanting to open up more quickly. And I think we knew, universities wanted to get people back on campus because I guess they wanted to create that campus environment that they could be more confident that international students would come, and international students have, they bring with them their tuition fees, and if people are on campus, they're, using the amenities, they're going into the university cafes and shops and so forth. So I think we understood that, but we were very clear that we wanted spaces to be safe for everyone. People weren't going to have a choice whether they were delivering a lecture or not. So if they could deliver it remotely, it was safer for everyone. And we wanted to ensure that there was good ventilation. The people were wearing face coverings where they could, and there was social distancing, and a reduced occupancy. So I suppose one of the tensions was when the First Minister said 5% of students on campus, and we wanted to be counting people that were in libraries and study spaces in that 5%, because it felt like a very arbitrary number, so it didn't feel that it was taking into account, the environment on campus. So, if you were in a modern lecture theatre which had good ventilation and you could reduce the capacity. That felt better than if you were in a really cramped classroom and you were cramming more people in. So yeah, I think sometimes it felt like arbitrary in terms of how how the rules were being stretched or flexed for us. And as I say, our priority was keeping people as safe as possible and limiting the number. So doing lectures remotely, but maybe having a tutorial of 20 people in a big lecture space so that they could feel people could feel more safe, because all of the evidence that we were getting from SAGE or our expert advisory group was really stressing that ventilation and limiting, transmission, by face coverings and so forth was the way to keep people safer for longer.
And it's maybe an unfair question, but how effective does UCU consider the Scottish Government's stakeholder engagement to have been in terms of incorporating diverse perspectives in relation to impacts and responding to the needs of the sector?
So do you mean how?
Just the whole engagement. You've described different methods of engaging, but how the whole, taken as a whole, how effective was that as a means of making sure all voices and all concerns were taken on board?
I think having the ministerial leadership group and the COVID recovery group was that we were all round the table. I know certainly my colleagues from the union in England, they didn't have like the same opportunities that we were having in Scotland, which we felt was a positive. And hearing from the experts and being able to put our points direct to government, I think was really important. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was a good way of bringing everyone together very quickly and to get that, to hear the perspectives from us all. Thank
you. Just like to touch on then issues around reopening of universities. I think you've probably touched on both of them already. One was the removal of default remote working or learning from guidance, and you've already mentioned your position in relation to that. But what was UCT Scotland's position on the importance of retaining a default remote working learning clause in the Scottish Government's sectoral guidance for universities? Yeah, I think it enabled us to continue to deliver education safely. And as I said, it meant that particularly at the autumn 2020, because we knew the pandemic was increasing, and certainly in early 2021, thousands of people were still dying, and people were still getting COVID, people were having the effects of long COVID. So that cautious approach was absolutely fundamental to us, so that only activities that couldn't be done remotely or were time sensitive, and it just meant that there was more space to do those more safely on campus. So that point of really minimising in-person activity, I think, was key, because this was beneficial for students who may have been vulnerable to keep them safe, as well as staff. And what were the concerns? Because obviously it was removed at I think it was in published guidance on the 1st of September 2020. So what were the union's concerns about the decision to remove that at that point? Well, it meant that we had the really difficult period that we did in September. The rush back to campus really backfired, and it meant you had so many students self-isolating, not being able to get the support that they might have done from parents or guardians if they'd have maybe had a more gradual return to campus. It was a really difficult period, and actually we did have to go back to remote learning because the virus was spreading again, and I think at that point we went to a sort of levels and different tiers in different areas. So it was a difficult period. And then you've touched on this already, but what was the UCU Scotland's reaction to the First Minister's statement in February 2021 that only 5% of students would be able to go onto campus? Because obviously we've heard from the universities that that was quite a small figure relative to some of the sizes of some campuses.
Yeah, but yeah, I think, well, I guess we'd wanted students that were on campus maybe using study spaces or libraries. We wanted them to be included in that 5%, and they weren't. So I guess we were just concerned that, you know, it was quite an arbitrary figure, that it meant there would be more people on campus than actually needed to be there. You know, as I say, I think in February 2021, thousands of people were still dying. The virus was still spreading. Lots of people were unvaccinated, and we didn't know. We didn't know enough about the virus to be supporting people who were seriously ill. So, our priority was ensuring that people weren't being forced to be back on campus, and that staff who might have been vulnerable or who had family members that were vulnerable, weren't put in that position of taking the virus back to their loved ones.
And UCU's position on the importance of maintaining the 2-metre social distancing rule, how did that differ from university employers, and what was the rationale for advocating a stricter 2-metre rule?
Yeah, I mean, we were very much steered by the guidance from SAGE and independent SAGE. Some of our members who were expert in these various areas were party to both SAGE and independent SAGE and on the expert advisory group. And, they were just advising us that the virus spreads by aerosol transmission. So, the mitigations that you can put in place to prevent and minimise transmission. And we knew that ventilation and limiting numbers in given areas. So having that 2-metre social distancing rule was incredibly important to keep people safe.
And then you've mentioned their ventilation. You set out at paragraph 35 that UCU participated in discussions with the Scottish Government about acceptable levels of ventilation. What was driving UCU or its members' concerns about ventilation? Was that being raised by members, or was that something?
Yes, our members, but also again this was from SAGE, the expert group that were advising government, as well as independent SAGE, who were again experts advising on safe ventilation rates. So yeah, we wanted stringent standards to be implemented. So we set out the requirements that we wanted. They didn't go to the level that we wanted, but we were very clear that this was in the interest of people's health and safety to minimise transmission rates.
And were any undertakings or assurances given as to how the issue of ventilation in schools and educational settings would be dealt with?
I mean, there were. I'm sure there was guidance. Sorry, there was guidance that was issued, which, as I say, wasn't as good as the ventilation standards that we were expecting. But yeah, and I know. I mean, we were also encouraging the use of CO2 monitors, because that was a really good proxy for ventilation, and yeah, we were. In fact, I recall this would have been probably autumn 2021. I mean, I, along with health and safety reps in a number of institutions, we went to sort of check on the ventilation levels and rates and so forth in lecture halls and so forth.
And I think you've answered this already when you said it didn't go far enough, but how important did the union consider the issue of ventilation to be in mitigating COVID-19 transmission, and how effectively do you consider the government's guidance addressed this concern?
I mean, we thought it was key, and that was because the experts were telling us that this was a virus that was transmitted by ventilation, so by poor ventilation and by aerosol transmission. So, yeah, for us it was it was really crucial, and we would have liked the Scottish Government to go further. And I think we also felt that this was moving forward, this was something that really should be taken on board, because there's lots of viruses and diseases that are that poor ventilation enables to spread more easily. So for us, this was a really positive recommendation that should be taken forward, because it would have health benefits generally for the population.
And then, just in relation to vaccination, what was UCU's Scotland's position on the prioritisation of university staff for COVID-19 vaccination?
Yeah, I mean, we weren't asking for special measures for our members or students, but we certainly encouraged our members to take up vaccination, and students were also encouraged to be vaccinated, and our members who would have been in vulnerable groups would have would have been prioritised in terms of that, how vulnerable people were in the population as a whole.
So you were just encouraging to take up the vaccination,
Yeah.
rather than asking for priority to be given for members?
Yeah, that's right.
And are you able to provide any examples of specific health and safety measures or protocols that the union successfully pushed for in its discussions with the Scottish Government?
Yeah, actually, I suppose when this was November 2020, when there was the different tiers were being devised, and tier 4 was, I guess, the sort of highest if the virus was spreading and was more of a risk, and so. And our definition of what restricted blending learning might be, that was accepted by the government, and that featured, in the guidance at the time. So as I say, I think we were making really important representations. There were times when our comments were taken on board, and there were times when they perhaps weren't to the extent that we would have wanted, and I think it possibly depended. Like I mentioned, there was the expert advisory group who were scientists and experts in the field, and I guess when their advice coincided with ours, it was more likely that what we were asking for appeared in the guidance or the rules.
Thank you. And we've already touched on some of the mental health and well-being concerns that your members had, and you referred to the survey that you conducted in summer of 2021. Was there anything in relation to anxiety or workload that you'd wish to add to what you've already mentioned?
I think I've covered a lot, haven't I? That our members reported, workloads really increasing. This added to anxiety. I don't really have anything to add.
And then I'll just invite you to, you've got a section about potential lessons to be learned, but are there any potential lessons to be learned that you'd like to draw to the inquiry's attention as particularly key from the perspective of UCU and its members?
Yeah. I mean, I do think the COVID recovery group was incredibly important to bringing the stakeholders, the students, trade unions, employers together. I think that was really important. I guess I suppose the over-reliance of the sector on international tuition fees from overseas students, and the over-reliance of the sector on commercial income. And I would say it does that to a greater extent now than it did in March 2020. And when we saw that income was at risk, it was really problematic. The fact that, the sector doesn't fund teaching Scottish domiciled students fully, and that there is that reliance on that international student fee income. It was problematic during the pandemic. I think it would be even in a worse situation now than we were in March 2020. And I guess that the workloads, the fact that our members are reporting that their workloads are higher now than they were in March 2020. I think that all adds for you know, real real challenges to the sector. I feel that our safety first approach, you know, I think it's something that the union stands by. So, you know, I think, that was important. Having the sectoral guidance, I think that was also incredibly useful. I think we had concerns perhaps how it was maybe implemented at times and how it might have been flexed to the limits, but I certainly do think it was really useful to have that that guidance for the sector as a whole in Scotland.
Good. Thank you very much, Ms. Senior. My Lord, I don't have any further questions unless your Lordship has anything.
Thank you, Ms. Messerhausen, and thank you, Ms. Senior. That's all, and 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you.